Coming up, the New York Football Giants add to their secondary, signing veteran quarterback David Long Jr., but was he the right choice relative to the players available on the market? We'll take a look at that as well as other potential depth pieces that could be added along the way, plus Darius Slayton and the contract demands. How much of that has cooled off, and should the New York Football Giants still be interested in extending the draft pick from a few years ago? We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends, it's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, where you know that I am your host, Adam Arbrecht. I'm healthy, I'm wealthy, I'm wise on a Friday morning, talking about the New York Football Giants, some additions in the secondary, as we say, and still some narratives here that we want to continue to flesh out. Mentioned Darius Slayton, obviously a fifth-round wide receiver draft pick. Is he now on the outs when we talk about the signing of Malik Neighbors, or drafting, we should say, to go along with already having Jalen Hyatt, to go along with already having Wan'Dale Robinson, and to go along with the fact that we have seen Joe Shane slowly over the first two and now into his third season weed out some of the Dave Gettleman holdovers over the course of his tenure. So we'll talk about all of that. But first and foremost, David Long Jr. gets brought in for the New York Football Giants, adding into this secondary. We talked about, okay, you draft Andrew Phillips. We really like what he can develop into. Looks like playing in the slot primarily to start is going to be the best bet for him. Discussed Cordell Flott, some flexibility, they say, positional versatility. Okay, that's great. But even with adding Tyler Nubin on the back end of this defense, you still know you wanted to put another player in that room. My maybe problem here is we're talking about a 26-year-old in David Long Jr., bounced around a little bit over these last couple of years with Carolina, with Green Bay along the way, just really played a spectrum here. My biggest concern, and I wouldn't say concern, but just I'm going to talk about him relative to another player that we had mentioned. And we don't have contract details yet at this point. They may have come out of, after the time of this recording. But when you go and look at his numbers, going back to 2019, drafted third round by the LA Rams. Okay, fine. But you are looking at a player who was targeted over these last two seasons 32 times, in 2022, 75% completion percentage, 17 times in 2023, a 74% completion percentage. You also have the fact that over the course of his career, when targeted, QB ratings 117.5, 154.2, 84.9, 113.3, 97.6, and 84.5. Now, listen, is this the end all be all? You're talking about fit, you're talking about scheme, right? You're trying to understand how you'll be a complementary piece inside of this room. That being said, again, the contract will matter. The Giants don't have limitless cap space to work with here. We have previously mentioned, going back maybe 2 or 3 episodes, Akello Witherspoon. This was the guy that I thought out there on the market. I had also previously mentioned Levi Wallace. He signed with the Denver Broncos. I, right now in this moment, would say I'll be interested to watch how Wallace plays in Denver and how we see Long play here with the New York Football Giants. There are going to be comps here, low-cost options on the market, and seeing them go into new situations with new teams is going to give some real kind of keep an eye on situations over the course of the season. And maybe it's all relative. You're not talking about your number one cornerback. You're not talking about one of your key draft picks that you brought in. Nevertheless, I still look at this as being a little bit of an eyebrow raise. So Witherspoon, first and foremost, why do I like him? Well, 6'2", 195. I always love a long, lean cornerback. Now, he is 29 years old. So if you're talking about a player that has a chance to develop inside your system and be a part of the team long term, then obviously going with a guy like Long makes sense. Going with a guy like Wallace, who I think is 28, certainly been the better direction. Witherspoon is 29. So you are getting a guy who, as we know, when it comes to cornerbacks, sometimes 30, 31 years old, you can start to see them fall off a cliff a little bit. But you go look at his numbers going back to San Francisco and through Pittsburgh, and also played with, wouldn't you know it, the LA Rams in 2023. Now, he's giving up completion percentages in the neighborhood, and there's some ups and downs here. But over the course of his entire career, 55, 56.6, 59.4, 37.8, 75.9, and then 48.1 this past season with the Rams. Bad season there in Pittsburgh a year prior. Played and started all 17 games this past season for the LA Rams. So that's a nice bolster for him as well. Bottom line being, with either one of these players, we're not talking about as we go flip back over to David Long. Starts? Well, he has a total of 9, 10, 11, about 13 starts on his career. So neither one of these guys, as we make this comp, are going to be players that you look at and say, oh, well, look how much that they've played with consistency. Mostly because the last 2 seasons in Pittsburgh, you saw Witherspoon only start 7 games combined. Now, he only played in 13 games total. But again, go back to his rookie campaign 2018, 14 games, 12 started, 10 games, 8 started, 11 games, 4 started, trending in a bit of the wrong direction here. But I just thought this is a player to me, depending on what we end up seeing him sign for, is certainly a name that I would have liked to have seen the Giants look at, maybe more potentially than going and getting a player like Long. It's all relative. You needed to bring in other bodies here. So we're not going to sit and really, cast aspersions. Other players that people have thrown out here just to kind of run down a little bit of the list. Gilmore is out there. 33-year-old going to be 34-year-old cornerback. That's not the cup of tea, and he's probably looking for a payday. Some fans have even said, "Is this much of an upgrade over Adoree Jackson?" Maybe, maybe not. Remember, Adoree Jackson is 28 years old as well, and which actually that's insane. I got to double check that number. Hold on a second. Adoree Jackson, oh, he'll be 29. Okay, so he's a little over, he's 28.6 years old. But if you go and look, so let's just bring up Adoree Jackson as the example. Now, here's the big difference when you talk about these other players. That's why I mentioned Gilmore wants a payday. If you go over on Spot Track right now, you're going to get that Adoree Jackson's market value is somewhere around $10 million, a little bit north, 10.5 million. That seems high to me. And I think as this market continues to dwindle down, it's probably not going to end up being what he signs for ultimately. But when you go and look at, so 2023, just to give you an idea, remember, can he still play outside? Maybe, maybe not, right? So now you're talking about how did he fare when he was asked to move into the slot and move around the defense a lot? Well, he played in 14 games and started 14 games. He gave up 65.9% completion percentage, 88 targets, high volume, 58 receptions, right? By far, the worst completion percentage against him going back to 2020 with his last season in Tennessee was a bad year for him before he came over to the Giants and then really turned it around for those first couple of seasons. I do have that question mark about it, right? Because 56.5 in his rookie campaign, 66.7 the second year, got at that peak worst, 81.3%. Now, again, that's 2020. He gets injured at 16 targets. It's, 13 catches. So he doesn't play a lot. 3 games, 2 started, and had a falling out in Tennessee, essentially. When he comes over to the Giants, it's high volume and pretty consistent reps. Now, again, this past season, especially when you talk about having to go play more slot, yeah, the missed tackle percentage absolutely skyrockets. The first 2 years with the Giants, 8.8 and 5.6 respectively in those seasons, 12.5 this past year. And I'm not advocating for the Giants to bring back Adoree Jackson, but I am advocating for the idea of asking the question, what is the intention here when we talk about this secondary? You don't, you look at the board, the way it falls, you go weapon high in the draft, that's great. You end up going with the safety because maybe the board falls and you like him and it's a fit and it's a need, all those things. And we're a fan of Tyler Newman. Don't get me wrong. I think we're going to look back at that as being a great decision from Joe Shane to let Xavier McKinney walk and to immediately bring in a rookie contract to replace him, and one that probably will give you a little more in Bowen's system, complementary football relative to the other pieces that you have on this team. But I do have pause here. And that's if David Long ends up, give me the numbers on his contract. Is he here to compete? Is he here to have the job? Or are we talking about, along with Cordell Flott, you brought in Andrew Phillips, and we're just going to go ahead and let all these guys play within this, and it's going to be situational football. So interesting to say the least. Not the name that I had on my mind when it came to the Giants adding to the secondary. Still a long way to go in the offseason as well. Coming up here next, though, let's talk about some of the other veteran players that are on the market still, especially inside the linebacker room. Want to bring up Bud Dupree. Interesting player to think about here specifically. And we talk about the other pieces on this team currently and where he could stand to excel. We'll get into that coming up here in just one moment. As we roll along, a reminder that today's episode is brought to you by 2 of our partners. First, Personam. It's an AI-driven cyber threat detection engine. Personam improves your vision into your network security environment and allows you to see cyber threats that other tools and platforms simply cannot do. Personam is always vigilant and always learning. And Pietential, Pietential, is that free online assessment tool, basically a little wellness check-in for individual users, 100% free, where you can go ahead and set a baseline, have options and ways to improve your well-being, and also track your progress over time. These are things that sometimes we say tongue in cheek about. If you're a draft pick and you're waiting in the green room to get your name called, yeah, go ahead and get a little potential in your life. But also if you're making big decisions, jobs, relationships, all those kinds of things that factor into it, when you can set a baseline for yourself and see where you are over time, you can ensure that you're working through these things and keeping yourself on track. So get over to Potential, Pietential, today and get yourself a little bit of wellness. So when we talk about now thinking about, as we expected, players to be brought in here, whether it's going to be guys that have a guaranteed roster spot or just to compete with this team as you work your way towards camp, there are plenty of names. And I threw out Bud Dupree there pretty quickly, mostly because I just think when we start to talk about what he can bring to the table, you can end up being talking about a player that has high value specifically for the New York Football Giants. So again, over on Spot Track, we're talking about a 5.7 AAV value on a contract, market value, 1 year deal. Now, why would you want to take a look at a player who's 31, going to be 32 years old, goes against the grain for me in terms of players that I want to bring in? I want to have young guys. I want to have guys that I can build with the core. I want to have guys that have upside. However, when you look at Bud Dupree, who went from Tennessee the last 2 seasons before playing 2023 with Atlanta, I got to tell you, man, 16 games started, right? The completion percentage against them is high, but on very low sample sizes because that's not part of what he's doing. What I do like about him is that when you look at the blitz, 33 this past year for Atlanta, hurries 13. So I mean, it's a good ratio being sent to get after the quarterback and getting home, relatively speaking. 13 hurries, 3 knockdowns, 6.5 sacks, 24 pressures, 39 combined tackles, only 4 missed tackles. They're sub 10%, usually a decent benchmark for where you want guys to be. Why do I think that this is a good fit, or why do I think the Giants at under 6 million should try to find a way to make some cap room for him? Think about the fact that Atlanta is a relatively barren defensive wasteland last season, or the last few seasons for them, and they have some work to do there. But if you look at the Giants now, well, you brought in Brian Burns. You have Bobby Okereke. You have Kayvon Thibodeau. You have Azeez Ojulari, even though he has his injury concerns, right? You have Dexter Lawrence. You have all of these weapons down there in the trenches. And if you're talking about wanting to have a player that gives you a little bit of a safety net around Azeez Ojulari to make sure that he's going to be healthy enough to play and then productive, because I think that question mark still hangs out there. And remember, that's one of the players that we have to watch to see what's going to happen when it comes to his next contract opportunity and whether or not he has real longevity with the New York Football Giants. This is the same reason why I said get a defensive lineman potentially in the mid to late draft here if you can, because you give yourself a chance to make a strength that much stronger. Let's have our front seven be a really dangerous unit that maybe allows a guy like David Long to be successful inside of the defensive system, or for rookies, Andrew Phillips, Tyler Newman, to be successful inside of the defensive system, because you know that your front can get a lot of pressure, be disruptive against opposing QBs, and give you opportunities to do a little more ball hawking, not have to defend for 5, 6, 7 seconds downfield, quick dropbacks, quick hurries, get the ball out of the QB's hands, make them make fast decisions, right? Listen, if you're talking about sub 6 million here, there are far worse decisions that you can make about spending money than getting a guy like Bud Dupree. And I mentioned those sacks. Had 4 the year prior, 3 in Tennessee. You got to go all the way back to see some real numbers again. Go back to Pittsburgh in 2020 when he's just 27 years old. 8 sacks there, obviously, right? Big, almost 20 sacks over a 2-year stretch in 2019 and 2020 when he was with the Steelers. Again, if I can get this guy, who, by the way, had combined 17 tackles in 2021, missed 0, 18 combined tackles in 2022, missed 0. And then I mentioned that big number really elevated. He was asked to, as a veteran, do a ton for the Atlanta Hawks, the Atlanta Falcons, because they were bad. And you needed a veteran with some experience. And he came in and he served that role. And I think he served that role quite well for that team. So if I was out there on the market looking at Bud Dupree has to be a viable option for this team. Let's flip the script over to the other side of the football here, then, too. There's other names we're going to talk about. We want to kind of keep these rolling as we work our way through this offseason because we're going to see this happen. You're going to see consistently just names and players start to get grabbed up by different teams. We also went and took a look at some of the players on the offensive line market. Now, you've got guys like Andrews Pete, who previously played with the New Orleans Saints. You can look at Leno from Washington. I don't think you want to go for a near 33-year-old. And there's a lot of guys like that. Bakhtiari, also going to be 33 years old. I don't think we're going for Dwayne Brown, 39 years old. There's a lot of age out there on the market right now. Connor Williams, yes, but plays center, so that's probably not going to be an option you're going to go in that way. We talk about getting to the more youth-based options out there on the market. But then you talk about a player maybe like Donovan Smith, 30, 31 years old, played for Kansas City. His market value, when you go and check it, 5.1 million. Like getting into, we're getting into territory here where we can start to have a conversation about realistic options maybe for the New York Football Giants to have some success. Now, if we think about particularly in Donovan Smith's case, we'll go by PFF for these comparisons just to get a baseline of the number. This past season for him in 2023, we're talking about a guy that played 749 snaps, gave up 9 penalties, had 2 sacks allowed, 55.4 PFF. Back it up, 58.8 the year prior, playing over 900 snaps, still 12 penalties, still 6 sacks allowed. 2021 was a good year for the guy, right? Just 8 penalties, but only 1 sack allowed, and 83.3, though, PFF grade. Is that the kind of guy that you go out for $5 million and say, hey, we have a bit of an option here? You can be certainly give us some depth. We've had injury concerns, but getting towards 31 years old maybe is not the highest option you want to have on your board. Dalton Risner, who does come with a hefty price tag of 10.1, has been a name that some people have thrown out. Now, he's just a little bit, he's almost 29 years old. So if we're talking about a 3-year by Spot Track's metrics, $30 million deal, this is probably why you end up not going the Dalton Risner way, simply because it's too much to pay for a player that in another year could end up be looking like, well, did we make a mistake here? Do we feel like we now need to get that next option? I think the Giants have kind of indicated you make 2 high-level signings in the offseason for the offensive line. You still have Evan Neal to figure out, and then you have young players, obviously, with John Michael Schmitz in the middle. And whether or not we agree with it, you have Illuminor now, obviously, there. You have Runyon there. But when you think about the rest of this offensive line, you do still have young talent, and they're drafted young talent by Joe Shane. So we're going to have to get to the bottom of whether or not they can be good enough in order to be considered long-term options. But Dalton Risner, the reason why I find him at least interesting is he played with the Vikings this past season, but you go and look at it, man. Now, here's what you like about it. The grade itself, again, using PFF in this instance, 57.1, not great, but 3 penalties over 745 snaps and 0 sacks allowed. 3 sacks allowed the year prior, just a 61.1 PFF grade, but only 1 penalty taken, 967 snaps. Go back to 2021, one of the better ones here, 832 reps, 68.5 PFF grade, just 2 penalties taken, 4 sacks allowed, though. The bottom line is that, my interest and concern here, because by the way, back in 2020, he played 999 snaps, 61.3 PFF, but no penalties, no sacks allowed. Consistency, right? Veteran with consistency that you could potentially rely on. My concern here would be kind of like in the Glowinski mold, where you bring a player in, yeah, you want to have a decent baseline, but what you end up with is maybe overcommitting financially to a player that's never going to quite live up to that. So I don't know if the Giants are going to end up adding a player to the offensive line mix, but when you look out there, there are certainly options for them to choose from, no doubt about it. There's plenty of veteran options out there on the market. It may come down to who shakes free. And we also, by the way, we'll get into this a little bit more in depth as we move through the offseason. But remember, the Giants did also have a ton of undrafted free agents brought in. And if I go ahead and just look at that list real quick, you'll get a sense of what they went out and grabbed, continuing to try to bring in more bodies, right? So you did have, let's see, you got 2 wide receivers being brought in, but you also have 2 offensive linemen signed here in Kubas out of North Dakota State. You also had Marcellus Johnson out of Missouri. So they brought in 2 offensive tackles, but then also reported rookie tryout invitees. Well, you're going to get William Barnes out of North Carolina in the mix here. You're also going to get Duplain out of Michigan State. You're also going to get Chaz Neal out of Florida Atlanta. So you go and you look at that and you say, well, that's a laundry list, and maybe they want to keep things simple. Evan Neal, Chaz Neal, make it really easy. But you did bring in enough players to get in the mix here to suggest the Giants signed in free agency and then also have guys on the line. By the way, just in terms of bringing in names, ton of DBs are on that list. Andre White, Labrosi. You also have Gervin out of Kansas. That's three more defensive backs that were brought in for invite tryouts that are expected. Only one listed in terms of undrafted free agents. That's going to be Alex Johnson out of UCLA. So you brought in one more player into that secondary. Wide receivers are all over this list, obviously, too. And then the linebackers, they more litter some of the invitees, like Andre White out of Georgia, like Drake out of Jacksonville State. So you're getting a lot of these guys to get into the room. And as you always talk about, turn over that roster, create better depth, create better competition. But interesting to see how the Giants look at this and whether or not a name comes up where if signed, you would say, okay, let's go look at the depth chart. Let's have that conversation. And that's going to be the first thing we'll kick off next week with resetting our depth chart and understanding and identifying where we feel like still want to go make some headway, or at least keep an eye on these battles in camp. Coming up here in a second, though, the Giants drafted Malik Neighbors 6th overall in the draft. What does it mean for Darius Slayton? He is there. He wanted the contract extension, tried to push for it before the draft, tried to push for it after the draft. Some people seem to think that this could be the end of the road for him or that they'll just ride out the contract. I'll give you a reason why maybe they do actually give him the extension that he's been asking for, even if not quite at the price point. We'll get into that in just one moment. All right, so closing out today's show inside the wide receiver room. Now, when we talk about the New York Football Giants and some of the contracts that are getting thrown around for wide receivers on the open market, you certainly take a look at the internal and have to like what you see, because the Giants right now are not paying a significant amount of money to their wide receiver room. You have obviously a player like Malik Neighbors just brought in here. So you go ahead and you see that you're going to have Wandale Robinson. Well, he's on the 4-year, $8 million deal, $2 million AAV. You've got Jalen Hyatt, $1.4 million AAV. You've got Darius Slayton, the 2-year, $12 million, $6 million AAV. When we talk about Malik Neighbors' contract, I'll have to try to actually get that pulled up here to see where that currently stands now when we talk about his rookie deal, because I don't have that number right in front of me, although we might be able to get there if we do our due diligence here in a second. But as we bring that up in the background, you love that you're not spending a ton of money right now. One of the interesting things that came up is that T. Higgins for Cincinnati, who demanded a trade, but then they also came out that he's looking for something in the neighborhood of Michael Pittman with the Colts, something like 20-ish million dollars a year. Now that's a big figure, but it's not a massive number if you're thinking that he wants to push closer to number one money and be closer to $30 million than to 20. Whether or not that means the Giants should be exploring that possibility, I'm not going to do it for T. Higgins. At that point, I look at what I have in Darius Slayton and I like it. But what would the benefit be of the New York Football Giants extending Darius Slayton? Because it's not just about, well, now you've already brought in Malik Neighbors, so why would you need to do that? Well, the reason to do it would be that if you extend Darius Slayton off of his 2 years, $12 million, right? You can end up giving yourself cap savings of 3.6 million. So what is that number going to end up looking like? I don't know. He's averaging 6 AAV. Do you want to sit here and say, let's push him towards 10 or 11 million? Does that seem like an insanely high number? You may say that. I guarantee that he's going to be productive this season now that you have Malik Neighbors in there and you have Wandale Robinson coming on in year number 3 and you have Jalen Hyatt stepping up as he gets into year number 2. If you go ahead and you add on another year or two, the reason why I think it makes sense is, one, as I mentioned, you're going to go ahead and give yourself a little bit of cap relief in the short term, make it possible to go sign someone on the market, maybe a Bud Dupree to continue to bolster the defense. And also, even though you could say, well, doesn't that make it less attractive to trade him at the deadline in season if he now has more money on the books? Yes and no. Yes, it could be prohibitive or restrictive because teams are going to look and say, well, I could have had him on a $6 million deal. Now I got to pay him 10 to 12 million and another couple of years on the contract. The flip side of that is, exactly what you're getting. You're getting a player under control, no contract negotiations necessary. And you also have a player like, I think everyone has kind of come around on this a little bit more. You have a player that has been productive. The big knock on Darius Slayton has simply been that he's a player that struggled to catch the football early on, right? The drop percentages were too much. He had a drop percentage in 2021 of 10.3. He had a drop percentage of 9.9 in 2022. But then all of a sudden in 2023, with a hodgepodge of quarterbacks from Daniel Jones to Tyrod Taylor to Tommy DeVito, he only dropped 3.8%, three drops out of a total of 79 targets, 50 receptions, 770 yards. I You have to look at him and say the last 2 seasons over 700 yards, obviously. First 2 seasons of his NFL career over 700 yards, had the missed games and only 5 starts, 13 games in 2021. Inconsistency. But all of a sudden, when you start giving a more consistent role, 16 games, 11 starts, 17 games, 13 starts, go back to the beginning of his career. We know rookie campaign, right? Big year for him in terms of touchdown catches, but also it was a big year in terms of 14 games, 9 started, 16 games in 2020 with 15 games started. And guess what? In those first 2 years, 2.4 drop percentage rookie campaign, loved it on 48 receptions, 84 targets, 96 targets, 50 receptions, 6.3% drop percentage. Yes, he had 2021 and 22 bad seasons, a lot of drops, but he cleaned it right back up. If you can't take them away, but when you look at the first 2 and this most recent season, the drop percentage is on point. He is a productive player. So it's one of 2 avenues. You can sit here and say, hey, man, we got you on contract and we're not going to extend you. And you were a 5th round wide receiver and you're not going to be here long term because we brought in all these other players. That's possible. Do you want to rely heavily on Isaiah Hodgins to step up in that room in the short term? You can. I don't know if that's going to be the smartest way to go. But if you think that, and Bryce Ford Wheaton is there as well, and you're going to have a lot of players in camp, there's a lot of possibilities about how things could change. McKenzie was brought in here this offseason as well. But if you're going to sit here and talk about wanting to still have consistency, Jalen Hyatt, year number 2, a lot of growth for him to accomplish. Darius Slayton is a very solid option to make sure that you don't have concerns inside the wide receiver room. Isaiah Hodgins, as we mentioned, 17 games, 9 started this past year, 21 receptions on 33 targets. Okay. Right. Like it's fine. Doesn't drop footballs, by the way. Incredibly consistent in that regard. But we certainly didn't see that next step taken when he was brought over and he played 6 games, started 5, 42 targets, 33 catches, 351 yards. We thought, man, maybe the Giants and Joe Shane went to Buffalo and they got this guy off the practice squad and he's going to really give you something. I think it's a big question mark now going into this season. So whether or not it's the consistency that he brings, whether or not you think that he's deserving of a next larger contract here, extending Darius Slayton frees up cap room in the short term, keeps him also cost controlled in the long term. There's nothing wrong with keeping him around for 2 or 3 more years and having him be the veteran in that wide receiver room. There's nothing wrong with that at all. And you also give yourself flexibility if you end up wanting to move him, get a draft asset for him, or maybe you end up bringing in another player that a team is looking kind of in similar circumstances. Don't know if we're going to bring him back, has a little bit of money on the books, could just be a better fit and could have a larger role somewhere else. I don't think this story is fully written yet, and I'll be very interested to see how the Giants and Joe Shane approach this. Because I don't think there's anything wrong with putting a little bit of extra money in Darius Slayton's pocket and keeping your options open and also keeping a pretty darn consistent player in terms of availability on the field for you as well. So don't sell yourself short when you're about to potentially walk into the prime of Darius Slayton's career. Whatever Darius Slayton is going to be, he is right now 27 years old. This is it, right? So 27, 28, 29. Throw an extra year on, give a little more money, and just go ahead and stabilize that position. Because guess what? Another year later, you can dip back into the draft. You can think about other big splashes, but you're not spending a lot of money inside that room right now. So you really don't have to be concerned about investing a little bit extra into a player as a 5th round pick. Dave Gettleman didn't do much, but this is a guy that certainly has well outperformed his draft stock going back to when he was brought in. As I mentioned at the top, I said years ago, but I mean, he was brought in 2019. Thank you very much. We got there in the end. That's the deal. David Long Jr. in the secondary. Okay. Let's see. Let's see how camp goes. Let's see where that role gets defined. Still question marks there for me. Any other veterans? Bud Dupree, certainly. Offensive line help? Maybe, though unlikely. We'll continue to highlight players in that vein as well. And then Darius Slayton. Why? Why turn our backs on a player that has done some pretty darn good things for a team that has not had a lot to be excited or to cheer about? Interesting to see. Holdover from previous regime. Unlikely that he gets the extension, but as we've painted the path here, certainly options if you choose to go that way. Get over to YouTube, One Giant Podcast, over on X at One Giant Podcast, at Adam Armbrecht, and at AMAC214. For Andy, of course, we'll be back again on Monday. More of these type of discussions. What's the next list of players? Who do we like from the undrafted rookie free agent class? I know we touched on obviously bringing in the running back here and taking a look at what that means. Now getting tied maybe to Kareem Hunt. I'm trying to figure out how are they going to dwindle out this running back room. Seems like some guys that we have familiarity with are going to be on the outside looking in when it's all said and done. But a lot to flesh out as we work our way through the offseason, training camp, walkthroughs. Daniel Jones is out there. We understand. And yes, one last note here. At the end of the day, Daniel Jones and Drew Lock, those are the quarterbacks for this team. Tommy DeVito is here as well. They brought in a D3 product. We'll talk about him. This is the quarterback room. So we can stop having these conversations about what the Giants tried to do at the top of the draft and how they weren't able to do it and what it means and the PR fixing that they're trying to do around Daniel Jones. It doesn't matter. This is what we have here. So let's start to set expectations for the offense, not Daniel Jones, not Drew Lock, for the offense, because that's what matters in this upcoming season. Seeing progress for a team with a head coach in Brian Daboll, and we think a good offensive mind in Mike Kafka, who are supposed to be really good at setting up successful offensive systems. We have not seen that come to fruition yet. It's not just about the QB, not just about the offensive line, not just about the skill position. So a lot of things to dial in on here as we continue. Get us on all those great platforms, podcast feeds as well. Until next time. Until the best times, as Andrew Makowitz, if he were here, would want, need, and nay, demand that people know. As always, let's go Big Blue.